Hey y'all, welcome back to the Brianna Approved Podcast. I'm going to forewarn everybody that this entire episode is basically a nerd alert episode. We are really getting into it this episode. We are talking about Berberine, which is not nature's Ozempic, but it is an amazing plant compound. So in this episode, we are going to talk about mechanisms of action for Berberine. We are going to talk about GLP-1 specifically and how that is connected to the Ozempic Berberine conversation. We will talk about cellular and molecular targets that Berberine specifically works on. So why I actually love it as a plant compound and not necessarily for a quote weight loss kind of miracle. And then at the end, we will talk about dosage and contraindications. But to start the show, let's get into the fun fact of the day while I sip cafe. Did you know that berberine is a bitter tasting and yellow color compound that is found in several plants and has been part of the Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine for years? That's right. Berberine itself is a plant compound that is found in various plants like golden seal, like Oregon grape. It's generally found in the roots and the rhizomes as well as the stem barks, and it is not a plant itself. A lot of people think that berberine is a plant. It's not. It is a plant compound. What's interesting is that the hydrochloride salts, so something that is found in berberine, this has actually been listed as an oral antimicrobial agent in the Pharmacopoeia of the People's Republic of China. So it's been used in Chinese medicine, like I said, for years, generally in a pill form for gastrointestinal infections. What's interesting is that a lot of my original research in berberine and why I started using it in my own practice and with clients and things like that is for its ability to work on things related to GI tract issues. So if somebody is having like an antifungal, antiparasitic protocol, perhaps berberine has been used in the past. So that's the more you know on berberine. Now, the next section of the show, I want to talk a little bit about semaglutide / Ozempic, what that means in conversation to berberine, and then GLP-1, because that's a big part of this whole berberine conversation and why these weight loss medications are happening and sort of the original implications for those. So first we're going to talk about GLP-1, and then we're going to connect semaglutides, GLP-1 and Ozempic, and then we will get into how that all relates to berberine. So what is GLP-1? GLP-1 stands for glucagon-like peptide 1s. This is an incretin, which is basically hormones that are released by nutrients from the GI tract. And so when these incretins are discharged into circulation and scattered by the gastrointestinal and endocrine cells, what they do, these metabolic hormones, is that they can stimulate a decrease in blood glucose levels. So incretins are released. So these GLP-1s, these hormones are released after we eat. And what they can do is that they can augment, they can change how much insulin is secreted from the pancreatic beta cells. And this is what is going to regulate blood glucose. And so again, this gut-derived hormone can increase the effect of glucose-dependent insulin excretion. And when glucose is too high, this can help to lower glucose and then can contribute ultimately to glucose homeostasis. So research in the GLP-1 field, what the research is showing us is that GLP-1s can improve metabolic and glycemic control. They can improve weight loss via the suppression of glucagon, which basically regulates blood glucose levels and the secretion of blood glucose. And it can also lead to a delay in gastric clearing and gastrointestinal fat absorption, and then potentially reducing food intake. Now, when we talk about semaglutides, particularly Ozempic, what we know is that semaglutides belong to a class of medications known as glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists, okay? And so what these semaglutides do, things like Ozempic and Wegovy, is that they mimic the GLP-1 hormone that is released in the GI tract in response to eating. So one of the roles of these GLP-1s is that it basically prompts the body to produce more insulin, which then reduces blood glucose. So when people are talking about things like Ozempic and Wegovy, that is just the brand name of a semaglutide. And the semaglutide belongs to a class of medications that are known as glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists. Now, this is important because agonists are chemicals that activate a receptor to produce a biological response. And what it can do is it can basically mimic the action of a neurotransmitter or a hormone to produce a response when it binds to a specific receptor. A lot of agonists you'll hear about, things like opioid agonists, as well as even something like coffee, right? Caffeine works on adenosine receptors. It's an adenosine receptor agonist, that's what helps us to feel more alert. And so again, GLP-1 in higher amounts can interact with parts of the brain that can reduce appetite and tell us that we're feeling full. So a lot of the mechanisms behind Ozempic and how it became so popular with weight loss is because it's basically delaying the release of gastric emptying, so we feel fuller longer. And for many people, it is reducing their appetite, so thus decreasing their overall caloric intake. And then it's working on insulin. And so again, insulin is a really big part of our blood sugar regulation, which is why it came on the market to be an anti-diabetic drug. And they found as one of the benefits is that people were losing weight, which is now why people are taking it as sort of this celebrity drug to lose weight. And again, there's some interesting research that these synthetic sort of GLP-1, type drugs, if you will, that they can have a modulatory effect again on the expression and secretion. So again, it's not that it's necessarily doing anything in the sense of making the fat, quote, disappear or go away. It's working on other mechanisms, which is why berberine, I think, got looped into this, it's nature's Ozempic, because there are certain constituents that are found in things like berberine, as well as even things like resveratrol and cinnamon and certain teas, so like green tea in particular, that can also influence GLP-1 release. And so I think berberine, for whatever reason, because there's a lot of research on its ability to regulate insulin levels. It's been compared to, nature's metformin in the past as well, is why it's kind of had a little bit of this glow up. But it is not nature's Ozempic, and that is for a good reason, because I think anytime we're taking pharmaceutical drugs, for better or worse, there is generally going to be a bit of a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. Perhaps you are taking this drug and it's working for XYZ, but then you're going to have a couple of different side effects now. What I like to always look at, as you all know, is health common denominators, because it's very rare that it's just one thing that exists on the market that is working on, let's say, for the case of, Ozempic and berberine, the only thing that lowers blood glucose. No, we want to always look at what are some other molecular pathways, similar cell signaling pathways as well, that can do the same thing. So yes, berberine can work on similar pathways to things like semaglutides. It's not going to work at that level, of course, because it's a natural, quote, ingredient. It's a natural compound found in plants, and pharmaceuticals are always going to be much more concentrated and generally working on one very specific pathway. So what I like about berberine, again, because it's naturally occurring alkaloid, yes, it has these antimicrobial benefits. Yes, it has antibacterial benefits. But what I love the most about berberine is that it actually works on cellular and molecular targets outside of insulin. So it works on things like AMPK. It works on things like our Sirtuin longevity genes. They can regulate these different biological processes that are related to metabolism, immunity, inflammation. And so again, it really is sort of working on this high level controller of energy homeostasis via, again, these kinase pathways, these sirtuin pathways, and these inflammatory pathways. So the next part of the show, we're going to talk about some of these very specific pathways that berberine works on, which is why I love berberine, not for quote weight loss, but because I look at it as sort of a supplement that is like an antioxidant, but it also works to support cellular metabolism. It works on all these other different things that ultimately support optimizing longevity. So it's that idea of getting the most bang for your buck health-wise. There's a lot more merit there than just, let's say, weight loss. And potentially for some people, yes, it can support and augment your weight loss journey, but I like it more as an elite supplement. So there's a lot of research that has been published around berberine's activity to, again, regulate multiple signaling pathways. This is important because signaling pathways, what they do is that they tell cells, hey, you should turn on or turn off certain genes, or you should turn on or turn off certain inflammatory cytokine production, or hey, you should help to recycle other antioxidants. And so because berberine can work as sort of this regulator of multiple signaling pathways, again, particularly NFKB, which modulates inflammation, Sirtuin, which is going to support longevity, as well as AMPK, which is going to have a lot of energy homeostasis properties. I love berberine because it paints a broader picture of what it can do to support our overall cellular health, which we know is what supports our overall health and longevity. So let's start with AMPK and how berberine is connected. So AMPK, you don't need to know the name, but if you want to know it, it stands for active adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase. Now, as we can tell, that does not roll off the tongue. So AMPK, what you need to know is that AMPK is our master metabolic regulator in cells. When we activate AMPK, it's analogous to flipping on a quote youth switch, because again, what it does is it helps to regulate cellular metabolism. So it regulates energy homeostasis by controlling the uptake of glucose and fatty acids by your cell. Again, which is why some people have called berberine nature's Ozempic, even though again, it's not going to work at the level as something like a pharmaceutical drug. But again, it basically monitors energy levels and the number of ATP molecules that we have in our cells. And it kind of works as an energy sensing enzyme. And it is activated when cells start running low on fuel. And like with anything, when we age, it can start to decline naturally. Now, what's cool about AMPK is that, yes, berberine can activate AMPK, which is amazing, but there's also some other lifestyle things that you can do to activate this pathway. So calorie restriction, and this is very specific, conscious calorie restriction, not bro dieting. This can actually make your fat cells release something called adipectin, which activates AMPK in several tissues, like our skeletal muscle. We know that HIIT exercise, so high intensity interval training, can activate it. Heat and cold stress as well can activate AMPK. And then there are certain polyphenols. So resveratrol, quercetin, there's a lot of research in their ability to activate it, as well as berberine. So again, you can do things like, heat shock, cold therapy, deliberately and consciously having these stressful situations. And then again, increasing your consumption of some plant compounds, anthocyanins that are found in blueberries, grapeseed extract, curcumin, zinc, EGCG, and then, like I said, resveratrol and quercetin and berberine, which is why we're having this whole conversation. But what you need to know is that it can also, AMPK, again, via things like berberine, can increase the production of various antioxidants and target free radical damage. Now, what's really cool, what is the coolest about AMPK is that it can influence other longevity pathways. So this is like going to a coffee shop that's your favorite and then getting, a free coffee. So we have this compound berberine that can, yes, activate AMPK, but it can also influence other longevity pathways like sirtuins, and it can modulate mTOR, which this is really important for muscle growth and cellular repair. But sirtuins specifically can regulate oxidative stress, it can regulate inflammation, and it can also play a role in how our mitochondria are functioning. So we love any nutrient that, again, is going to give us more bang for our health buck, if you will. And so we know that the mechanisms of the AMPK can then kind of have this positive domino effect, and then it's going to turn on some of these SIRT signaling pathways. There's also very cool research in berberine and AMPK in general. And again, it doesn't have to be activating AMPK from this specific compound, but from some of those other things we talked about, like, cold and heat exposure, various, polyphenols, that it has this strong antioxidant property and anti-inflammatory activity, and it can actually have cardioprotective effects as well. So it can improve post cardiac function recovery. This has again been some research in rats, which is interesting, and it can reduce the infrac size after injury. So just something to think about again when we're looking at drugs and what is the collateral damage that can happen. I'm not telling anybody to stop taking the drugs that they're taking, but if there's always an option first to try something natural or to take another route, what else can we think about, and what are the other underlying mechanisms and pathways? So again, a lot of the anti-diabetes drugs, so things like metformin, is one of the best known AMPK activators, which again, this is why I think berberine originally got on the market, because people were talking about berberine, and particularly women who were dealing with PCOS and they were on metformin. So there's been research that was done in the Journal of American Medical Association back in 2018, and they found that longevity increased in mice by using drugs like metformin and rapamycin. So longevity actually increased in these mice, which is really interesting if we now know that other things like anthocyanins, grapeseed extract, zinc, curcumin, quercetin, resveratrol, berberine, heat, cold exposure, and high intensity interval training, all of those things can also increase AMPK. So how cool is that? Okay, enough on AMPK. We love that. Berberine can support AMPK. What we know as well next is that berberine can also, again, activate these sirtuins. So SIRT1 and SIRT7, these longevity epigenetic regulators, these enzymes that can actually change the packaging of our DNA. They can turn genes on and off. They can control the reproduction of DNA repair. So what's cool when we can activate these SIRT1s, which berberine can do, is that when these longevity genes are activated, they don't just make life longer, they can make life healthier. So they can be thought of as vitality genes. So imagine turning on vitality genes from this really cool plant compound. There's also research in the idea of sirtuins being able to improve DNA repair. They can support cognition and memory. They can increase exercise endurance. And there was, again, a lot of this research has been in mice, so I always want to make that caveat. There was research that was showing that mice who had these sirtuins activated, it actually helped them stay thin regardless of what they ate. We are not mice. We have to still have an idea of our calorie consumption overall if our aesthetic goals are going to be something, whether they're attainable or not. But just, again, we know that these sirtuins can actually mute and kind of silence the overactivation of inflammation and these inflammatory compounds that can drive many diseases like metabolic disorders, like cardiovascular disease. There's even some research in arthritis and asthma. And then again, they can also support the mitochondria and prevent cell death. So again, great merit for a compound that is found in nature. And then I want to lastly talk about NFKB, which again is something that is going to regulate inflammation and how that plays a role in insulin and how berberine is connected. And then we'll finish the show out with dosage. So as a quick refresher, in case y'all don't remember, NF-kappa B is something that regulates pro-inflammatory cytokine production. So nuclear factor kappa light chain enhancer, NF-kappa B, right? Doesn't sound easy to kind of just say at the drop of a hat. So NF-kappa B, berberine has been shown to inhibit this. And this is really important because I love inflammation. As you all know, I've done episodes on this in the past. We need inflammation to stay alive. We need small amounts of it, but we don't want to have chronic inflammation going on all the time because that is one of those things that is a common denominator in a lot of other health issues. When we have NF-kappa B turned on, it can induce the expression of various pro-inflammatory genes, and these genes can regulate immune response, cell growth, proliferation, survival, and apoptosis, so that programs cell death, as well as our stress response and inflammasome regulation. And so inflammasomes are kind of these multi-protein complexes that come together in response to whether we've had something stressful happen or there's been some kind of infection that's been detected, and that can actually lead to the activation of something called caspase 1 mediated. And these are basically cells that control inflammation and cell death. So again, NF-kappa B, if this is turned on for too long, that can participate in inflammasome regulation, and that is what plays a role in controlling inflammation and cell death. So using something like berberine, which can work on inhibiting NF-kappa B, can actually lead to less secretion of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, particularly, like I said, working on balancing some of our T cells and our natural killer cells as well. Now, what's interesting to think about is NF-kappa B in the conversation of insulin, because we've been talking a lot about glucose regulation, semaglutides, GLP-1, how that all connects. Adipose tissue, so tissue that is found in our fat cells, they have something called adipose tissue macrophages. And this includes something called M1 ATMs. The name is not so important, but again, in these adipose tissue macrophages, they can induce an inflammatory response by producing pro-inflammatory cytokines like tumor necrosis factor, like interleukin 6, which can contribute to the induction of insulin resistance. So there's been research in berberine in regard to improving insulin resistance because it's actually reducing inflammation via the JNK signaling pathways, which again, that is involved in regulating different cellular events like how, the growth of our cells and programmed cell death. And then again, actually inhibiting some of these pro-inflammatory cytokines and even inhibiting things like lipopolysaccharides, which themselves can produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. So just really cool stuff. Again, berberine is not the only thing that does this, but this is why I love berberine for so much more than just focusing on something like weight loss. And then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about dosage and contraindications. So how much should we be taking it? When should we be taking it? And who should not be taking it? And as always, reminding people to think about your health common denominators. So anytime we're thinking about what is the best therapeutic option for me right now, how can I employ strategies that are going to aim to reduce things like our total cumulative load of inflammation, that can modulate things like oxidative stress, that can normalize lipid metabolism, that can support the mitochondria. Again, all of these things that are going to ultimately support cellular health, which cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs function and dysfunction together. So something like berberine has really amazing research in its ability to modulate these different molecular pathways and work on similar parallel pathways that other pharmaceutical drugs do, not at the extent that a pharmaceutical can do, but very interesting that it can work on parallel pathways. So to close out, you're excited. You're like, Bree, how do I take this? When do I take this? Dosage and contraindications. So a lot of the research talks about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams daily, which is going to have the strongest effect. What's important is that it should be a split dosage after meals. So most people will take about 500 milligrams 3 times per day. So you want to divide this into 3 or 4 doses throughout the day, again, anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams. There are some people who, if you take too much berberine at once, can get an upset stomach. They can get some cramping and potentially diarrhea as well. So do be aware of that. There is some in vivo research that talks about it having low bioavailability. But again, I think this is why context is important and why we should always think about how we take something and when we take something. So not taking 2,000 milligrams at once, but dividing that dosage throughout the day. We also know that there are certain people who should not be taking berberine. So again, specifically if you're taking golden seal as a source of berberine, if you are pregnant or breastfeeding, that is advised against. Also, if you are somebody who is already on metformin, you should discuss with your doctor, but I would likely advise against it, as well as medications for high blood pressure. A lot of the times berberine can interact with our blood pressure medication, making your blood pressure to go too low. So monitor that. But anytime you're adding anything new in, always speak to your doctor first, because we want to make sure that we're safe and compliant and everything is good to go. So that was a lot of that was a lot of information in one episode. I am probably going to go back and even re-listen and take notes, but just again, as a general recap, we know that berberine itself is not an actual plant. Berberine is the compound. It's this bitter tasting yellow colored chemical that's found in plants, like golden seal and Oregon grape. And it can have really cool modulating effects on things like insulin, but it can also work on activating things like AMPK, our sirtuin genes, and actually downregulating things like NFKB, which play a role in inflammation. We also learned here today that GLP-1 is this group of hormones basically that is released by nutrients from the GI tract that can play a role on regulating our insulin secretion. And so when everyone's talking about Ozempic and Wegovy, and what that means is that this class of medications, these semaglutides, can work as glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists. So this is what can help to reduce blood glucose. And again, we're not saying that berberine is anywhere near what things like Ozempic and semaglutide do, but it is important to understand mechanism of action. How does this actually work? What does this mean in the conversation? So hopefully this was really exciting and helpful for you. And hopefully some of you will be trying out some berberine sometime soon, but talk to your doctor first. And hope you all have an amazing day. I will see you soon. Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba. Pew!